In this first video we're going to look at option 3, the riskiest choice available, where 23rd Hussars bypass Soliers and push through the gap straight for the ridgeline. And at this point we're dealing with 2 full tank regiments in play, so this won't be a blow-by-blow account. Instead, I'll try and focus on the bigger picture and the key moments that define how the battle unfolds. I'll also be clear and set the tone early. This ends in a tactical defeat. You could say what unfolds here is a case of doing the same thing and expecting different results, which, as the old saying goes, is the definition of insanity. But in their frontal attack on the ridge, most of C Squadron is knocked out. B Squadron, trying to hammer through the edge of Soliers to join them, also runs into ambushes, and A Squadron doesn't fare much better. Now this was a bizarre choice to make. We already knew what might happen when trying this route, because we'd seen it happen to B Squadron from 2nd 5 and 4-5 Yeomanry. They attempted the same push through the gap, and they got blown to bits. But I suppose here's the caveat. From the perspective of the 23rd Hussars, they don't realise they're actually repeating the same mistakes. The fog of war means that they're not fully aware of the danger, and in preference for open tank country over the close village fighting, they pull round and make the same call. In fact, I believe I've even read that in reality, the regiment began by making almost exactly this decision for precisely that reason. And you can even hear some recordings of the tankers long after the war recalling their realisation that the burning tanks that they were approaching were not the enemy's but their own. In the remaining playtime I also discovered that I'd made a complete misjudgment. The Panthers didn't just halt on the ridgeline to reinforce it, instead they launch into the now familiar counterattack. This comes as a pincer and it pushes through both villages. For the Germans, moving through the villages makes sense in a way that it doesn't quite for us. These were their friendly lines. They could be expecting to pass through other German units instead of ambushes. Perhaps their plan was to confirm both villages were secure before driving on, but whatever the reason, they'd drive through both villages. Looking back, I'm not entirely sure why I convinced myself they were going to simply hold the ridgeline. We've seen time and time again that the Germans will go into a counterattack, but that long pause where they're overlooking Thur from the ridge did play a big part in it, so it really does look like they're reinforcing. In reality, they could simply be confirming the positions clear before carrying on, and they do carry on, so this results in 2 nasty village fights instead of the clean breakout that I might have been expecting. In Thur, we were at least prepared for this, so units were positioned along the main road and tanks were tucked into hedgerows. Over in Soliers, the 23rd Hussars did also manage to put some snap ambushes in once they realised what was happening. Even so, 3 or 4 Panthers did manage to punch through. By the end of the game, they were sat on this northern edge of the village, looking out across the open fields towards Grenfell. Both cases showed missed opportunities. The ambushes were there, but the execution wasn't quite right yet. So in 4, for example, I learned kind of a painful lesson when the Panthers tore into the southernmost platoon's half-tracks. I thought they were hidden safely behind a tall wall, but Combat Mission clearly had other ideas. And it's generally the same story with troop and tank placement, so Piat positions that I thought were concealed turned out not to be. At best they were sitting on a sharp angle and the Panther would simply trundle on up the road and smash them with HE. Tanks placed in alleys also needed a rethink. I think I'll come back to that in a later video on option 2 though, because even in the second run I still didn't quite perfect it, but I suppose I've got some new perspectives in terms of why. Away from the village fighting, there's also some lessons to think about for support. Perhaps more useful for future battles than this one though. I never really managed to make effective use of either artillery or air support. Neither managed to do much to blunt the Panthers' counterattack. Artillery was never really cut out for destroying vehicles, even when they sort of neatly lined up on the ridge. At best, a direct hit might destroy or immobilise a tank, but otherwise it seemed to just damage tracks and optics or periscopes. Or at least discourage the crew from unbuttoning, but in hindsight that felt like too much to ask of the 25-pounders. Mortars may well have achieved a similar effect without the same commitment. Airstrikes were equally underwhelming. When the Typhoons did return to our sector, they knocked out a few vehicles lingering on the ridge, but safely directing them from the ground observer's position was tricky, and although they made a few rocket and gun runs, they weren't quite the decisive hammer I was expecting. Maybe that's not just a game mechanic. So there's a good section in Corridor of Death which argues that rockets in particular never quite delivered against armour. Even in the hands of skilled pilots, accuracy was poor on them, and what you do see is cannon and machine gun fire often had a better chance of scoring hits with prolonged bursts. German prisoner of war accounts mostly described the air power as disrupting traffic and movement, rather than destroying tanks outright. And on this there's three main effects really. So movement being restricted to night moves, crews taking cover when aircraft approached, and then vehicles having to be driven off the main roads onto side routes. That predominantly covers the march phase though, and perhaps can explain why we see some difference once these German forces have deployed into a counterattack on the open ground. The book also makes clear that when rockets did score a hit, the results were catastrophic. No record seems to exist of a tank surviving a direct rocket strike, but those hits were rare. Statistically, guns were most likely to hit, then rockets, then bombs, and this is probably based upon the volume of actual fire. What can't really be quantified in the game, but comes through strongly in the source, is the morale effect. For the Germans, rocket-firing Typhoons became a kind of terror weapon. Prisoners of war described the distinctive noise of both diving aircraft and rockets as deeply unsettling, often prompting men to take cover for up to 10 minutes, expecting a follow-up with cannon fire. Tank crews who stayed inside and weren't hit often emerged with only superficial damage, but again, keeping inexperienced crew from bailing in panic was a real problem. On the British side, the effect was almost the opposite. Morale soared when close air support was overhead, but it would dip if it wasn't. So the conclusion in the Corridor of Death is that morale, not physical destruction, was the greatest effect of air power, though it was short-lived and needed to be tightly coordinated with the ground operation. That does make me wonder how well the game models these factors. It would be interesting to see whether morale buffs or suppression indicators reflect troops panicking under rocket attack, or conversely, whether friendly units get a positive morale boost when air support is nearby. So what did we learn from this run, and what questions did I start asking myself? Well, firstly, I saw that an M3 Honey could rattle the crew of a Panther enough to force their dismount. None of the shots actually penetrated, but the psychological effect seemed obvious. When they hopped out, they looked like they'd had their head under a church bell that had been hammered. The next thing, I suppose, is the fact that I was smashed by a counterattack that I'd completely misread. I think in the first video I talk about the idea that it is coming into a counterattack and then change my mind, thinking that they're going to sit on the ridge, but the Panthers didn't just sit on the ridge. They do go into a counterattack in that pincer through the villages. The change in enemy behaviour sort of turned my plan on its head a bit, and playing different options now risks being driven by hindsight. So once I know the Germans will counterattack, everything I do is sort of shaded by that knowledge. The danger is that I start cheating with hindsight rather than testing the plans on their own terms. On the strategic goal versus the tactical reality, we're still in this sort of tension between the big strategic aim of breaking through to the ridge and the immediate tactical problems, so managing traffic, clearing villages, manoeuvring and fighting. On the tactical side, I'm seeing that manoeuvring large formations in the available space is clumsy and slow. Movement management is almost becoming as important as the actual fighting. Then strategically, and thinking about victory points, I'm probably fighting myself to at best an acceptable draw. That's something I'll have to accept dropping the day's objective in a game where the objectives have not changed. Now this actual option was meant to be the idea of catching them on the hop, so I had toyed with the idea of striking the Panthers before they deployed, and it's this idea that we're going to catch them loitering on the ridge. But by this time the counterattack's already developed and that opportunity's gone, so that's then raising the question, was I simply too late? And I suppose the follow-on question is, was it ever going to be possible? A big part of this was always the terrain. The gap is an hourglass choke point. It funnels movement and kills momentum. You either dive in tight and accept the high concentration of force, and therefore high risk from enemy fires or pile-ups, or you spread out and keep freedom to manoeuvre, but give up local weight of fire and support. Concentration buys me the punch, but despite taking 4, we'd still take fire from Soliers and the ridge, which has now got more tanks on it. Dispersion avoids that vulnerability, but dilutes the shock effect, allowing the enemy to pick you off piecemeal. I suppose another major factor that we've not really talked about is tank quality, and here the numbers really underline the risk. So if you look at Corridor of Death and what we've seen in this run, they both paint the same picture, that Shermans are very vulnerable. On average, it takes about 1.6 hits to knock one out, whereas the Panther soaks up closer to 2.5 hits, or about 1.9 penetrations. So that's 2 penetrations before it's actually knocked out. And if you look at Tigers, they're tougher still. The Panther's edge, I suppose, then, lies in its resilience after the first strike. It's far less likely to be destroyed outright, while my Shermans are often finished off with 1 hit. The post-battle damage analysis backs this up, and again it mirrors the book's findings. Most of the Panther penetrations are either on the turret's side or rear, or on the hull side or rear, and again, just like the book's lower numbers, hits on the rear are actually a bit of a rarity, so getting round behind the Panther itself is just difficult because of the battlefield geometry. So I suppose big questions from this run are, was I already too late for the breakout to overwork? And how much of my decision making came from the game's morale model, and how much came from my own morale? Is it the mechanics pushing me towards caution, or is it simply my own reluctance to take any more tank losses? In terms of concrete lessons that we're going to try and take forward and change in the next attempt, we're really only looking at tactical adjustments, and these are all focused around the villages or the ambushes in them. I will be keeping the plan for the 23rd Hussars to push through Soliers on their own the same, but there'll be a little more focus on the structure of the movement through the village to kind of create a depth. So we're going to still go for the leapfrogging troops, basically because that's all you can really squeeze into the space, but it's this idea of leaving fighting positions in depth. It's more keeping one foot on the ground for balance, because we know there's going to be this reliable old German counterattack that's on its way. In terms of my movement and traffic management, I'm also going to adjust this slightly, so I need to have this idea of pre-planned rally points or reversing routes that need to be considered in case a unit needs to withdraw quickly. I can't really rely on the improvisation within the village. Over in 4, I'm going to try and hide those half tracks deeper in the village rather than tucking them behind that not quite tall enough wall. And I'll try repositioning the Piats away from those obvious sharp angles. So basically what I want here is for the Piat to sit where the Panther can't just drive up and plaster with high explosives. It needs to be a position that's further back, a bit deeper into the actual village, that's keyholing onto exposed flanks. For the artillery, we'll accept that we can only really suppress for this. There's no guarantee of tank kills. And similarly with the airstrikes, we're going to continue using this against the ridge line. So that's off to our front in depth against static targets, really. So we'll call it there. The game continues to punish the smallest errors in timing and placement. We're going to stick with option 2, where the 23rd Hussars are going to push solo through Soliers. We are going to be less of a headlong charge, more of a choreographed depth. I still don't love the idea of tanks driving on their own straight into a village, but we've got to imagine the defender feels just as much dread seeing a regiment roll towards them. So we'll catch you in the next one. I won't say goodbye, just so long.